If one day you lost your job, lost your home, lost your very name in the industry, all because you dared to tell the truth, would you do it again? Jolene Whitmore had to answer that question twice in her life. The first time, she lost everything. The second time, she nearly lost someone else's life. But before any of that, this story has to start on a winter night in Chicago, when the temperature dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Jolene sat huddled against the wall of a shuttered train station, quietly counting what she had left. A backpack, one clean set of clothes, a small medical kit she couldn't bring herself to sell even after she'd sold everything else because that kit felt like the last remaining piece of the person she used to be, and a small photograph, creased at the corner, the first patient she ever saved when she started in the profession. Just 7 months earlier, she had been an emergency room nurse at a major hospital. She had an apartment, a paycheck, her name on a staff roster. Then she did something that anyone with a conscience would have done. She reported a senior doctor, whose negligence was costing patients their lives, and the entire medical industry slammed every door shut in her face. That night, shivering in the biting cold, Jolene had no idea that just 3 blocks away, there was a small diner that would turn its lights on at 5 the next morning. The owner, a 64-year-old woman, would see her sitting on the front steps, arms wrapped around her backpack, lips purple from the cold. And she wouldn't ask, "Are you okay?" She would say just one thing. "You know how to wash dishes?" From that single sentence, everything began. Because that small, ordinary diner sat on the territory of a man whose name half of Chicago didn't dare speak aloud. And within 6 months, Jolene Whitmore would save that man's life with the very hands the medical world had thrown away. If this story touched you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded doing the right thing is never wasted. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the stories coming next. The next morning, before the streetlights had fully gone out, Jolene pushed herself up from the wall of the train station. Her body was stiff from the cold, her knees trembling as she stood. But she stood anyway. The past 7 months had taught her one thing. If she stayed down, she would die. If she kept moving, there was still a chance. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, shoved both hands into the pockets of her coat, and started walking toward the southern part of the neighborhood, where she had heard there were small diners, laundromats, grocery stores, places that might need help without asking too many questions about the past. She passed 4 blocks, 3 closed shops, 2 places with hiring signs that clearly said kitchen experience required. She didn't have kitchen experience. She had experience keeping people alive in an emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning, but that didn't help her here. On the 5th block, she saw Pearl's, a small place, narrow frontage, an old awning worn thin in several places, and on the glass door, a handwritten sign in black ink, "Help Wanted Kitchen Assistant." No mention of experience, no conditions, just those 4 words. Jolene stood in front of the door for 2 seconds, took a breath, then pushed it open and stepped inside. Behind the counter, a gray-haired woman with her hair neatly tied up was wiping down the stovetop. She didn't look up right away. Jolene waited. When the woman finally raised her head, her eyes moved over Jolene from top to bottom in exactly 2 seconds. The kind of look from someone who had lived long enough to judge a person without needing to hear them speak. Jolene said, "I saw the sign on the door. I'd like to apply for the job." The woman asked, "Do you know how to cook anything?" Jolene shook her head. "No, but I learn fast and I don't mind hard work." Pearl studied her for another second. Then she turned and pointed toward the kitchen. "There's a pile of dishes from last night in there. Wash them all. Then we'll see." Jolene set her backpack in the corner of the kitchen and began washing. The water was cold because the heater hadn't kicked in yet, but she didn't say a word. She washed each plate one by one, carefully, more carefully than necessary, because she understood this wasn't a test of skill, it was a test of character. Pearl wanted to know if she was the kind of person who would quit after 10 minutes. She washed for 2 hours. No breaks, no complaints, no asking when it would be done. When the last dish was set upside down on the rack, Jolene wiped her hands on her pants and stepped out. Pearl was standing at the counter, and in front of her was a plate, scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, a cup of hot coffee. Jolene looked at the plate, then at Pearl. "People who work for me don't go hungry," Pearl said. No smile, no trace of pity, just a statement of fact, the same way someone might say it's cold today. Jolene sat down. She picked up the fork and began to eat. Slowly, one bite at a time. She cut the eggs into small, even pieces, chewing carefully, swallowing slowly, setting the fork down between bites, not because she wasn't hungry. She was so hungry her hand trembled slightly as she held the fork, and her stomach tightened when the smell of eggs reached her nose. But she wouldn't let anyone see that. Not out of pride, but because she had lost too much, and the way she ate a simple breakfast was the last thing she still controlled. Pearl stood behind the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, and she didn't look at Jolene. But she saw everything. She saw the way the girl cut the eggs into smaller pieces to make them last longer. She saw the way she set the fork down between bites to force herself to slow down, and she saw the slight tremor in her hand when she lifted the cup for her first sip of coffee. Pearl had lived 64 years. She knew what hunger looked like, and she knew what dignity looked like. When those two things appeared together in one person, she didn't need to hear another word. Jolene finished eating. She stood, carried her plate and cup to the sink, washed them clean, and set them upside down on the rack with the dishes she had just finished. Then she turned back to Pearl. "So do I get the job?" Pearl poured more coffee into her cup. "Be here at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. 1 minute late and don't come back." Jolene nodded. No overflowing thanks. No promises. Just a nod, as she picked up her backpack from the corner of the kitchen and walked out the door. Pearl watched the girl through the glass as she left. Then she looked down at the dishes on the rack, clean enough that she didn't need to wash a single one again. During the first 3 days, Jolene arrived at the diner at 4:45 in the morning and left only after Pearl locked the door. She washed dishes, mopped floors, helped clear tables, learned how to light the gas stove properly, learned how to make coffee the way Pearl required it. Strong but not burned, hot but not boiling. She didn't ask about wages, didn't ask about breaks, didn't ask anything except what needed to be done next. Pearl didn't praise her. She simply stopped correcting her on the second day. And with Pearl, that was praise enough. Every night, when the diner closed, Jolene slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked out the front. Pearl didn't ask where she was going. Jolene didn't say. Both of them kept their own silence like an agreement neither one needed to sign. But on the morning of the 4th day, Pearl arrived at the diner at 4:15, 15 minutes earlier than usual. Because the night before she had lain awake thinking about the flower order that needed to be placed, then decided to get up early and take care of it. She turned into the alley beside the diner, where the back door led into the kitchen, and there she saw Jolene. The girl was curled up on the step, her back against the iron door, her head slumped to one side, both arms wrapped around her backpack against her chest, and in her right hand she was still holding the table rag from the night before. She was sleeping here. Not just tonight. Pearl looked at the way the girl had folded herself in, looked at the way she clutched that backpack as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling, and she understood that this girl had slept on the diner's back step all 3 nights. It was just that on the first 2 mornings, Pearl had arrived at 5 o'clock, and by then Jolene had already woken up, cleaned herself up, and stood waiting in front of the diner, as if she had only just walked there. Pearl stood watching for 2 seconds. Then she stepped past Jolene, unlocked the back door, and pushed the iron door open. The sound of the door startled Jolene awake. Her eyes flew open, her body tightening with the reflex of someone used to sleeping where it wasn't safe. When she realized it was Pearl, her shoulders lowered, but the caution in her eyes remained. Pearl didn't look at her. She walked inside, turned on the kitchen light, and called back in an ordinary voice, as if she were talking about the weather. "Behind the kitchen, there's a storage room. There's an old sofa in there. Anyone who works for me and doesn't have a place to sleep sleeps there. It's not a favor. I need someone to open the diner at 5 o'clock, not someone freezing to death on my doorstep." She didn't turn around. She didn't wait for Jolene to answer. She poured water into the kettle and began preparing for the day like every other morning. Jolene sat on the step for a few more seconds. Then she stood, picked up the rag that had fallen to the ground, folded it, and stepped inside. That night, after the diner closed, Jolene didn't go out the front the way she had during the first 3 days. She walked toward the back of the kitchen and opened the storage room door. The room was small, just large enough for an old sofa covered in worn brown fabric, a blanket folded at one end of it, and a ceiling bulb hanging from the low ceiling. No window. Nothing else. Jolene set her backpack down on the floor. She opened it and took out a small medical kit. The kit she had kept for the past 7 months, when everything else had been sold, lost, or slipped out of her hands. She placed it on the iron shelf mounted to the wall, right at eye level, carefully adjusting it until it sat straight. Then she stood there, looking at the kit on the shelf for a while. It was the first thing she had done in this room that had nothing to do with work or survival. It was the act of someone placing a piece of herself somewhere. The way people hang family photographs on the wall of a new home. The way people tell themselves, "I'm here. At least for now. I'm here." Jolene lay down on the sofa, pulled the blanket up to her chest, and looked at the ceiling bulb. Then she closed her eyes. And that night, for the first time in 7 months, she slept more than 4 hours straight, without jolting awake in the middle of it. 2 weeks passed, and Jolene began to understand the rhythm of pearls the way a body understands breathing, without thinking, only doing. Open at 5 o'clock, turn on the stove, make the coffee. At 6 o'clock, the first customers, usually construction workers from the neighborhood stopping in for breakfast before heading to work. At 11 o'clock, the lunch rush ended. Tables were cleared, floors were mopped, and ingredients were prepared for the next day. She learned to cook faster than Pearl had expected. Her hands were used to small, precise, repeated motions, because 6 years in an emergency room had taught them how to work under pressure without trembling, how to hold tools without wasting a single, unnecessary movement. One morning, Pearl stood watching her slice onions, each slice so even it could almost have been measured, and said, "Your hands look more like a watchmaker's than a cook's." Jolene didn't know whether that was praise or criticism, but Pearl had already turned away, so she didn't ask. One Tuesday morning, at 6:15, the diner door opened, and 2 men walked in. The first man wore a charcoal 3-piece suit, his black hair cut short and neat, his steps neither fast nor slow, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who never needed to hurry, because everything around him would wait. The man behind him was half a head taller, wearing dark glasses even indoors, his eyes constantly sweeping the room with the habit of someone who guarded for a living. The first man went straight to the corner table on the left, against the wall, the seat where his back faced the side with no windows. He sat down, didn't look at the menu, didn't look around, didn't need to look at anything at all. The man in dark glasses sat at the next table, slightly angled, in a position where he could see both the front door and the back door. Jolene was wiping the counter when she saw Pearl personally carry out a tray of food, without anyone calling for her, without asking what he wanted. Pearl set the plate down in front of the man in the suit, said something very brief that Jolene couldn't hear clearly, then turned back inside. Jolene asked quietly, "Who is that?" Pearl didn't look up, her hands still arranging plates. A regular, "Don't ask anything else." The way Pearl said "don't ask" didn't sound like the way she said "don't ask" when Jolene had asked about the secret sauce recipe. That time had been a joke. This time wasn't. Jolene didn't ask anything else. 10 minutes later, Pearl told her to bring another cup of coffee to the corner table. Jolene set the cup on the tray, carried it with one hand as usual, and walked past 3 empty tables. When she reached the corner table, she tilted the tray slightly to lower the cup, but the rim of the tray caught on the edge of the plate already on the table. The coffee cup slid, and coffee spilled onto the man's suit sleeve. Jolene froze for 1 second. Then she said at once, "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. Let me get a towel." The man didn't look at the coffee stain. He looked at her. Behind her, the man in dark glasses had already risen from his chair, moving fast and silent as a shadow. Jolene felt it even without turning around. She felt the air behind her change, heavier, closer. The man in the suit kept looking at her. 3 seconds passed without anyone speaking, and those 3 seconds were longer than any 3 seconds Jolene had ever lived through. Then he said, his voice low and calm, "This suit was tailored for $3,000. A pause. Jolene stopped breathing. But Mrs. Pearl's coffee can't be bought with money. He looked down at his plate, picked up his fork, and continued eating breakfast as if nothing had happened. Behind her, the man in dark glasses sat back down in silence. Jolene returned to the kitchen, her legs moving faster than usual, her heart beating at a rhythm she had only ever felt in the worst emergency cases. She set the tray down on the counter, her hand trembling slightly. Pearl stood at the stove with her back turned, flipping eggs in a pan. Without turning around, she said, "That's Garrett Sinclair. You just spilled coffee on the most dangerous man on the South Side, and you're still alive. Tomorrow, remember to hold the tray with both hands." Pearl finished speaking, finished flipping the eggs, slid them onto a plate, and went out to serve another table. No further explanation. No saying who Garrett Sinclair was, what he did, why he was dangerous, or why the man with him had stood up when a cup of coffee spilled. Pearl didn't explain because Pearl believed there were some things that, if they needed explaining, Jolene shouldn't know, and if they didn't need explaining, she would understand on her own. Jolene stood in the kitchen, looking out through the small window. Garrett Sinclair was eating breakfast, calm as ever, his suit sleeve still marked with the spreading coffee stain. He didn't wipe it, didn't seem annoyed, didn't look back toward the kitchen. When he finished eating, he stood, left a stack of cash on the table that Jolene guessed was 10 times the price of the meal, then walked out the door, the man in dark glasses following behind him, and Pearl's returned to normal, as if nothing had just happened. But Jolene knew something had happened. She didn't know exactly what. She only knew that in those 3 silent seconds, when Garrett Sinclair looked at her, she felt as though she had just been read from the first page to the last by someone who read very quickly and remembered for a very long time. That night, in the private room behind the Meridian restaurant, Garrett sat at the dark wooden table, a glass of water in front of him, untouched. Knox stood across from him, placed a thin file on the table, then stepped back 1 pace, the exact distance he always kept when giving a report. Garrett didn't open the file right away. He looked at Knox. Knox understood that look as the signal to speak. Jolene Whitmore, 27 years old, former emergency room nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, fired 7 months ago after filing a complaint against the chief physician of the department for violating treatment procedures and putting a patient in danger. The complaint was dismissed. The chief physician wasn't disciplined. After that, she applied to 11 other hospitals in the Chicago area. None of them hired her. Lost her apartment 3 months ago because she couldn't afford the rent. Stayed in a shelter for 30 days. Then her time ran out. Currently living in the storage room behind Mrs. Pearl's diner, working as a kitchen assistant. Knox stopped. Garrett opened the file and turned through the pages one by one. Not fast, not slow. Reading the way a man reads when he's used to files. Looking for what lies between the lines, not merely reading the words themselves. Knox waited. When Garrett finished, he closed the file, placed it neatly on the table, and said nothing for a while. Knox asked, "Is there a problem? Do you need me to handle it?" Garrett looked up. She was willing to destroy her own career to protect someone she didn't know. He paused. "How many people like that have you met in your life?" Knox didn't answer, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer was none, and both of them already knew it. Garrett pushed the file aside, took a sip of water, and his voice shifted into a different register. Lower, sharper, the voice of a man moving from one matter to another without needing a transition. The Bryce situation. Report. Knox spoke briefly. Bryce, one of Garrett's 3 regional managers, had acted on his own and sent men into the West Side, territory currently controlled by Pruitt's group. No order, no approval, no clearance through anyone. 2 days earlier, Pruitt's men had discovered it, and the situation was growing tense. Knox finished and stood still. Garrett gave a slight nod. "Call Bryce in." Bryce arrived 15 minutes later. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he entered the room with a stride a little faster than usual, the walk of a man who knew he was in trouble but didn't yet know how deep that trouble went. He stood in front of Garrett's table and wasn't invited to sit. Garrett didn't look up immediately. He slid Jolene's file into the desk drawer, slowly, and only then did he raise his eyes to Bryce. "The West Side," Garrett said. "Tell me about it." Bryce began to explain. There had been an opportunity, an opening, a chance to expand quickly if they moved early. He managed about 4 sentences before Garrett raised one hand, lightly, just enough to stop Bryce halfway through. "Did I authorize it?" Garrett asked. 1 sentence, 4 words. Bryce went silent. Then he said, "No." Garrett nodded. "You're out of the organization tonight. Knox will take you out through the back door." Bryce opened his mouth as if to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe an excuse. Maybe a plea. But Garrett had already continued, his voice not changing in the slightest, not rising, not falling, flat as the surface of the water in the glass before him. "I don't punish people with violence. I punish them by leaving them to take care of themselves outside." Bryce stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked out. Knox led him toward the back door. The room was empty. Garrett sat alone and finished the glass of water. When Knox returned, he stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, the other turning the silver ring on his ring finger, slow and steady, a habit he had whenever his mind was calculating something he hadn't yet said aloud. Garrett said, "Clean up the damage Bryce left behind. The west side. Get it under control before the end of the week. If Pruitt reacts, report to me before doing anything." Knox nodded, but he didn't leave right away. He looked at the desk drawer where Garrett had just put Jolene Whitmore's file, then looked at Garrett. He didn't ask. Garrett didn't say anything more. There were things between two men who had worked together long enough that didn't need asking, didn't need saying, only one look to understand that the file had been placed in a drawer instead of thrown into the trash. And that meant Jolene Whitmore's story didn't end here. Knox left the room. Garrett remained seated, looking at the empty glass of water, thinking about a girl who had spilled coffee on his $3,000 suit and apologized with eyes that weren't afraid, only startled, and he knew the difference between those two things very well, because he had seen enough of both in his life. People who feared him didn't dare look him straight in the eye. That girl had looked straight at him, and her hand hadn't trembled because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid of losing the job, losing the small bit of footing she had only just gained in Mrs. Pearl's diner, in that room behind the kitchen. Garrett stood, turned off the private room light, and walked out. The Meridian had already closed. Outside, Chicago at night was cold and silent. He got into the car, Knox drove, and neither of them said a word on the way back. 1 week after Bryce was thrown out, the fallout came exactly as Knox had calculated, but earlier than Knox had expected. The power vacuum on the west side that Bryce had left behind became bait, and Pruitt's people weren't the kind to sit around waiting for an invitation. They tested it. Knox was the one sent to clean it up, and while cleaning it up, everything went wrong. No one ever retold the details of what happened that night on the west side, because things like that were never retold in detail. They only left consequences behind, and the consequence that night was Knox, standing at the back door of Pearl's at 11:40 at night, one hand pressed to his side, his dark shirt darker where his hand was holding pressure, his face pale, with two men supporting him on either side. Pearl opened the door after hearing the knock. She looked at Knox, looked at the two men, looked at the way Knox leaned slightly to one side and kept his hand clamped against his hip. She didn't panic. She didn't ask what had happened. She opened the door wider, stepped aside, and said, "Bring him in." Because this wasn't the first time Pearl had opened the back door after midnight for wounded men. She had lived on Chicago's South Side for 64 years. She had known Garrett Sinclair since he had nothing in life, and she understood that the price of being inside Garrett's protection was that, once in a while, she had to open the back door on nights like this. The two men laid Knox on the sofa in the storage room, the same sofa where Jolene slept every night. Knox lay down, eyes closed, his breathing shallow and quick. Pearl turned toward the closed storage room door, where Jolene was sleeping inside. She pushed the door open, stepped in, and shook Jolene's shoulder. "Wake up. Someone needs you." Jolene opened her eyes, took 2 seconds to come fully awake, then stepped into the outer room. She saw Knox on the sofa, the dark stain at his side, the two unfamiliar men leaning against the wall, Pearl standing nearby with the calm expression Jolene had learned was the one Pearl wore when nothing was calm at all. Jolene looked at Knox for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, something inside her shifted, fast and final, like someone had flipped a switch she had thought had been shut off forever 7 months ago. She was no longer the kitchen assistant washing dishes at Pearl's. She was an emergency room nurse. "Mrs. Pearl, I need boiling water, clean towels, and a flashlight if you have one. Hold the light for me," she said, her voice not trembling, not rushed, not rising, the same voice she had used hundreds of times in the emergency room when everything was chaos, and she was the only one who wasn't allowed to become chaos too. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink, thoroughly, quickly. According to the procedure her hands still remembered even though her mind had tried to forget. Then she opened the shelf and took down the medical kit. The kit she had placed there on the first night she moved into the storage room. The kit she had never sold even after she had sold everything else. She opened the lid. Inside, everything was in its proper place. Neat, orderly, arranged in the sequence she had chosen, because some things, even when unused, were kept ready, like an athlete's body that still kept its muscles even after stepping away from competition, like instinct that didn't die even when it was pushed down, only waited. And tonight, it didn't need to wait anymore. Jolene worked. Calm, precise, every movement following the right order. She checked the wound at Knox's hip, assessed it quickly, then began treating it. Pearl stood beside her holding the flashlight, saying nothing, asking nothing, only moving the beam with Jolene's hands whenever she changed position. The two men stood at the door in silence, watching the kitchen girl transform into someone else entirely before their eyes. Knox groaned softly once when Jolene reached the most painful part. She said to him, her voice steady, "I know. Hold on for one more minute." Knox clenched his teeth and didn't groan again. 20 minutes after Jolene began, Garrett stepped through the back door of Pearl's. He walked quickly, but when he reached the storage room doorway, he stopped. He didn't come in. He stood in the frame, one hand resting on the door jamb, and watched. Jolene was wrapping the bandage around Knox's hip, the final step. Her hands still steady, her eyes still fixed entirely on the wound, her mouth quietly telling Pearl, "One more layer of gauze, hand me the roll on the right." She didn't know Garrett was standing in the doorway. Or she knew and didn't care, because right then nothing mattered more than the work her hands were doing. When she finished the last wrap of bandage, she straightened, looked at Knox, checked his breathing, then said, "I've only treated this temporarily. You need to be somewhere with proper equipment within 24 hours. This will hold, but it won't replace proper care." Her voice was professional, decisive, leaving no room for personal emotion. The voice of someone who had separated herself from the situation in order to do what needed to be done, exactly the way the emergency room had taught her. Garrett spoke from the doorway, his voice low. "You've done enough." Jolene turned back. That was when she saw him, and for the first time since the morning she spilled coffee, the two of them looked straight into each other's eyes. Longer than 3 seconds. Last time, in the diner, Garrett had looked at her as if reading a page. This time was different. This time he looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had asked Knox the night before. "How many people like that have you met in your life?" Jolene didn't know that question. She only knew that the man standing in the doorway was looking at her in a way no one had looked at her since she lost everything. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something she couldn't name and could feel all too clearly. She looked away first, because she didn't know what to do with that gaze, and because her hands were still stained with antiseptic, and she needed to wash them, and washing her hands was something she knew how to do, while standing there and letting the most dangerous man on the South Side look at her like that was not. 3 days after that night, Knox was taken to the organization's private doctor, exactly as Jolene had demanded. He recovered quickly, or at least quickly by the standards of men who did the kind of work he did, which meant he could stand, could walk, and return to work before the wound had truly healed. Jolene didn't know that. She didn't ask about Knox after that night, and no one told her. She went back to washing dishes, wiping tables, helping in the kitchen, as if the night she had bandaged a strange man on the very sofa where she slept every night belonged to someone else. On Friday morning, Garrett came to Pearl's right on time, as he always did. The corner table on the left, his back to the wall, Knox at the next table. Pearl brought out the food without asking. Jolene was in the kitchen. She looked through the small window when she heard the door, saw Garrett sit down, and turned back to work. She didn't bring coffee to his table anymore, not because she was afraid of spilling it, but because after that night, she didn't know what distance she was supposed to keep from this man, and keeping physical distance was the simplest way not to have to find the answer. But today, when Garrett finished eating, he didn't stand. He remained seated, pushed his plate aside, and waited. Pearl walked past, and Garrett said something quietly to her. 1 minute later, Pearl came into the kitchen and looked at Jolene. "Go outside. He wants to talk." Jolene looked at Pearl. Pearl looked back, offering no further explanation, no advice on whether she should or shouldn't, only stating the truth before turning away. Jolene set the rag down on the counter and went out. She stood beside Garrett's table and didn't sit. Garrett looked up. "Sit down for 1 minute." She sat, keeping half a table's distance between them, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap, the posture of someone ready to stand at any moment. Garrett spoke directly, without circling around it. He needed someone with medical skill, someone who could handle situations when his people couldn't go to a hospital. He had seen her work that night. He would pay her more than any hospital in Chicago, and she wouldn't have to wash dishes anymore. When he finished, he looked at her and waited. Jolene was silent, not because she was considering it, but because she was choosing how to say no in a way that matched exactly what she meant. Then she said, "I won't trade my principles for a paycheck." Garrett's expression didn't change. "I'm not asking you to do wrong," he said. I'm asking you to save people. You decide where the line is." It was a good sentence. Jolene recognized that. A sentence spoken by someone very skilled at persuasion. Someone who knew how to place words exactly where they needed to be, so the listener had to stop and think. But Jolene had heard good sentences before. The chief physician had spoken very well, too, when he explained why there was nothing wrong with his treatment procedure, while the patient lay still in a bed and never woke again. She had learned that sometimes the best sentence in the room was the most dangerous one. Jolene stood. "My line is not working for someone when I don't know which side they're standing on." She looked at Garrett for one more second, not challenging, not afraid, only clear, then turned and walked back into the kitchen. She didn't look back. Garrett sat there for a while longer. Then he stood, left money on the table as always, and walked out the door. Knox was already waiting outside, leaning against the car, one hand in his trouser pocket. He opened the car door for Garrett, went around to the driver's side, and started the engine. They had gone 2 blocks when Knox said, "Eyes on the road. No one's ever turned you down twice in a row." Garrett looked out through the window. Chicago on a Friday morning. Traffic thick. Pedestrians hurrying. The city moving to its own rhythm without caring about the conversation that had just happened inside a small diner on the south side. "Because no one's ever had a reason that decent," Garrett said. Knox didn't answer. He turned left at the intersection, toward the Meridian. And inside the car, there was silence, but it was a different kind of silence from every Friday morning before, because both men in the car were thinking about the same person, and both knew the other was thinking it. But neither said it aloud, because that wasn't how they worked with each other. That night, Knox drove Garrett home and left. Garrett stood alone in the penthouse, took off his suit jacket and hung it over the back of a chair, didn't turn on the living room lights, and walked straight out to the balcony. Chicago stretched beneath him at night. Streetlights, headlights, lights from thousands of windows belonging to people living lives that had nothing to do with him. He sat down in the only chair on the balcony, an iron chair, cold, without taking the cushion. On the small table beside him, there was only one thing: a framed photograph, a picture of his mother, taken on some beach whose name he no longer remembered. She was laughing, her hair blown by the wind, one hand holding the brim of her hat. It was the only photograph of her he kept. Not because he didn't have others, but because out of all the pictures, only in this one was she smiling with her eyes too, the kind of smile he had seen only a few times in his life and never saw again after she fell ill. Garrett turned the watch on his left wrist. A cheap watch, its face slightly scratched, the leather strap old and worn near the buckle. His mother had bought it at a thrift shop, paid $2 for it, then came home and told him proudly that it was prettier than any watch his father wore. It ran 2 minutes slow every day, and she had said, "It's all right, I'm never in a hurry." That watch was now the cheapest thing on Garrett Sinclair's body, and the only thing he never took off. His mother became gravely ill when he still wasn't old enough to fully understand what was happening. His father, a man with real power in the underworld, chose not to help her get treatment. He saw her as an old problem to be left behind, a burden not worth investing in. He didn't say those words directly, but powerful men rarely need to speak directly. They only have to do nothing, and their doing nothing is already an answer. His mother could have begged. She knew how, but she didn't. She said, and this was the sentence Garrett remembered word for word, no matter how many years had passed. "That money is tied to something I don't want to touch." She died for keeping her principles, and from that day on, Garrett had promised himself one thing. He would never let anyone pay the price his mother had paid. No one should have to die for being stubborn, for keeping a conscience, for refusing to bow. To keep that promise, he had chosen to live without needing any principles, except one single principle: never turn his back on someone weaker than himself. Everything else, he could bend around. The law, morality, boundaries, he moved between them as necessary in order to survive and stay in control. But that principle, he didn't touch. It was the only trace of his mother left inside him, apart from the watch that ran 2 minutes slow every day. And now he had met Jolene Whitmore, a kitchen girl sleeping in a storage room, washing dishes with hands that should have been holding medical instruments, and she had just refused his money with a sentence so much like his mother's that it was almost painful. "I won't trade my principles." Garrett turned the watch once more. He could protect her. He had enough power, enough money, enough men to clear every obstacle from her path without her ever knowing. But his mother hadn't wanted to be protected that way either. His mother had wanted to be respected, wanted to choose for herself, wanted to hold on to her own dignity with her own hands even if the price was her life, and he hadn't been able to give her that while she was still alive. The question now was whether he would protect Jolene his way, or respect her the way his mother had wanted to be respected. Garrett looked at the photograph of his mother smiling on the beach. She didn't answer, because photographs don't answer, and the dead don't give advice. They only leave questions behind. He stood, picked up the frame, set it neatly back on the table, walked inside, and turned off the balcony light. He lay down on the bed in the dark room, eyes open, his left wrist still wearing the watch that ran 2 minutes behind the rest of the world. 2 weeks passed without anything happening, and sometimes nothing happening was the most frightening thing of all, because it made people start to believe that everything would be all right. Jolene began to believe it too. She had a place to sleep, a job, Pearl, the steady rhythm of the little diner whose every corner she had come to know by heart. She still thought about medicine every night before she slept, but she thought about it the way people think about someone who has left, still remembered, but no longer waited for, until that afternoon. The diner was quiet, with only 2 tables left uncleared after the customers had finished eating. Pearl had gone to the market to buy supplies for the evening meal and said she would be back in an hour. Jolene was wiping a table near the door when the door opened. She didn't look up right away because she was wringing out the rag, and her hands were still wet. When she looked up, she saw a man already seated at the middle table. Gray suit, salt and pepper hair, straight back, the posture of someone used to being served, not to waiting. Jolene froze. Her hand clenched the rag so tightly that water ran from it onto the floor, and she didn't even notice. She recognized him instantly. 7 months, 11 hospital rejections, 3 months homeless, and she still recognized him instantly. Because some faces are carved into memory not because they are beautiful or ugly, but because they are tied to the moment your life was broken. Dr. Harlan Tate. He didn't look at the menu. Didn't order. He looked at Jolene, and on his face was something she could only call satisfaction at seeing everything in its proper place, the way someone might feel satisfied to see a nail they had hammered still sitting firmly in the wall. "Jolene," he said, his voice normal, even friendly, like he had run into an old colleague at a party. Small world. Jolene said nothing. She stood there, rag in hand, feet not moving. Tate continued, still in that same voice. The voice of a man who didn't need to raise it because his power lived in the content, not the volume. He explained that a former resident who had once worked with Jolene had happened to stop by this diner for lunch the week before, recognized her, and mentioned it during a departmental meeting. Tate hadn't gone looking for her, he said. But now that he knew where she was, he thought he should stop by to make things clear. Clear meant this. If Jolene still had any intention of returning to medicine, he would make sure she didn't just lose a job, but also faced a countersuit for defaming his professional reputation. He had consulted a lawyer. He had the hospital board behind him. He had 30 years in the field, and connections Jolene could never reach. "You accused me without hard evidence," Tate said, and his voice remained normal, still friendly, still the voice of a doctor, explaining to a patient that the condition wasn't good. "I have the entire hospital board behind me. Who do you think will win?" Jolene stood still, not because she had nothing to say, but because he was right. She didn't have hard evidence. She had only her testimony, the testimony of a 27-year-old nurse against a 30-year career and an entire system. And the system had chosen its side long ago. Tate stood, buttoned his suit jacket, adjusted his cuff, every movement slow and precise. The movements of a man who knew he had said enough and didn't need to add another word. He walked out the door, didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Jolene stood in the middle of the empty diner, still holding the rag. The water had already drained out of it, and the rag was dry in her hand before she realized it. She didn't know how long she stood there. Maybe 1 minute, maybe 5. Then she walked into the storage room, closed the door, sat down on the floor, and leaned her back against the sofa. And she cried. For the first time since losing everything. 7 months. For 7 months, she hadn't cried when she was fired. Hadn't cried when 11 hospitals turned her down. Hadn't cried when she lost her home. Hadn't cried when she slept in a shelter, when her shelter time ran out. When she sat against the wall of a train station in the middle of a winter night at 7 degrees below zero. Hadn't cried when she ate her first breakfast at Pearl's and had to force herself to eat slowly to hide the fact that she was so hungry her hands were trembling. For 7 months, she had held it all in, and today she couldn't hold it anymore. Not because she was afraid of Tate, but because for 7 months she had endured without collapsing. And today the man who had pushed her into the pit came all the way to the place where she was trying to climb back up, looked her in the eye, and reminded her that she wasn't allowed to climb. She cried without making a sound. Sitting on the storage room floor, both arms wrapped around her knees, her face lowered, her shoulders shaking, Pearl returned to the diner 40 minutes later, carrying 2 bags of groceries. She set the bags on the counter and looked around. Jolene wasn't out front. She looked toward the storage room. The door was closed. She stood still for a while and listened, and she heard it. Not clearly, but enough. That small, strangled sound of someone crying while trying not to let anyone hear. Pearl didn't open the door, didn't knock, didn't ask what had happened. She went into the kitchen, turned on the kettle, took out a cup, and made a hot cup of coffee exactly the way that girl liked it. Strong, no sugar. She carried the coffee over and set it on the floor in front of the storage room door. Knocked once. Only once. Then she turned away, went back to the kitchen, began unpacking the groceries, and didn't look back. Because Pearl had lived 64 years, and she knew there were times when what a person needed wasn't someone asking, "Are you all right?" but someone placing a cup of coffee outside the door and walking away so that person could finish crying, finish hurting, gather themselves back together, and open the door on their own when they were ready. That same evening, in the private room behind the Meridian, Garrett was sitting there reviewing the ledgers when Knox walked in without knocking. Knox only walked in without knocking when something needed to be seen immediately. And Garrett had worked with him long enough to read the level of urgency in the way he opened a door. Knox set a tablet on the table, the screen already open, turned toward Garrett. Camera near Mrs. Pearl's diner. Today at 12:20. Garrett looked at the screen. A black and white image, the angle from outside the diner looking in through the glass door. Not very clear, but clear enough. A man walked into the diner. Gray suit, salt and pepper hair, sat down, didn't order. Jolene stood a few steps away from him, a rag in her hand, not moving. The man spoke. Jolene stood still. The man spoke again. Jolene still stood still. Then the man stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out. Didn't look back. The whole thing lasted less than 5 minutes. There was no footage of Jolene afterward, because the camera was outside the diner, and she had gone inside. But Garrett didn't need footage of afterward. He had seen enough. He saw the way Jolene stood, the way her shoulders went rigid when the man entered, the way her hand clenched the rag from beginning to end, and he understood that Jolene knew who that man was, and that the meeting hadn't been accidental. Knox said, "Anyone who enters Mrs. Pearl's diner with an aggressive posture is a neighborhood security issue. I check the cameras every day. This man isn't in our data. He isn't from our world." Garrett watched the video a second time. Slower. This time he didn't look at Jolene. He looked at the man. The way he sat, the way he spoke, the way he stood and buttoned his suit jacket with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who knew he held the higher ground and wanted the person in front of him to feel it clearly. Garrett knew that kind of man. He met that kind of man every day. The only difference was that in Garrett's world, they wore different clothes and used different weapons, but the way they pressed other people down was exactly the same. He closed the video, set the tablet down, and opened his desk drawer. Taking out the thin file on Jolene that Knox had given him a few weeks earlier, he turned to the page that listed the chief physician Jolene had reported, Dr. Harlan Tate. He looked at the name on the paper, looked back at the image of the man on the tablet screen, and without needing anyone to confirm it, he understood the whole story. That man had gone to Pearl's not to eat lunch, but to remind a 27-year-old girl washing dishes that she wasn't allowed to stand back up. Knox waited. Garrett closed the file, put it back in the drawer, and said, "Find me everything on Harlan Tate. Every patient case he has handled in the past 5 years. Every complaint from patients or patients' families. Every medical record that shows signs of being altered. I want it complete before Friday." Knox nodded. "Do we handle it now?" "Not yet." Garrett said not yet in a way Knox understood to mean yes, but at the right time, in the right way, and when I have everything I need in hand. Garrett added, his voice a little lower. "Don't let Mrs. Pearl know, and don't let her know." Knox looked at him, her meaning Jolene. Garrett looked back at Knox, and in his eyes there was something Knox had worked beside him for nearly 10 years, and rarely seen, Something between caution and care. Something Garrett would never name because naming it would make it more complicated than he wanted it to be. "She's the only person in this story who doesn't owe anyone anything," Garrett said. "Keep it that way." Knox didn't ask anything else. He picked up the tablet, nodded, and left the room. The door closed behind him. Garrett sat alone, looking at the drawer where Jolene's file lay beside the name Harlan Tate, and he thought that there were people in this life who used power to build, people who used power to destroy, and people like Harlan Tate, who used power to make sure that what had been destroyed could never be built again. Garrett wasn't a good man. He knew that better than anyone. But he was a man who kept his word. And that night, in the private room behind the Meridian restaurant, he told himself one thing, not aloud, only a decision forming in his mind and settling there, waiting for Friday. Friday came. Knox walked into the private room behind the Meridian with a file 4 times thicker than Jolene's, set it on the table in front of Garrett, and said nothing. Garrett opened it. 5 patient cases. 5 people who had lain in hospital beds under the care of Dr. Harlan Tate within the past 3 years and received treatment protocols that anyone with medical expertise would have questioned. 3 survived but were left with complications. 2 never left the hospital. In the 5 files, there were 3 cases in which the families had filed complaints. All 3 complaints had been handled internally, which meant they had vanished into the hospital's administrative system as if they had never existed. 2 medical records showed signs of being altered after the patients died. Note dates, and times that didn't match the shift logs. Small details, but enough for any investigative journalist to open up a much larger story. Garrett read everything. Every page, missing nothing. Then he closed the file, placed both hands on the cover, and said, "Send a copy to Diane Corwell at the Chicago Tribune. She still owes me from last year's case. Tell her to hold it, not publish it yet. Wait for my order." Knox nodded, but he didn't leave right away. He knew they weren't finished. Garrett continued. "Arrange a meeting. Send the invitation under the name of an investor interested in the medical field, who wants to discuss partnership opportunities with leading experts. Send it to Dr. Harlan Tate." Knox looked at Garrett for 1 second, then nodded again and left the room. On Saturday night, Tate arrived at the Meridian at 7 o'clock. He wore a black suit, a dark tie, and came alone, walking into the restaurant with the confident stride of a man used to being invited to elegant places. The hostess led him to the private dining room in the back, opened the door, and invited him to sit. The dining room had only 1 table, 2 chairs, and Garrett Sinclair was already seated there. Tate looked at Garrett. He didn't recognize him. He saw a man younger than himself, dressed in a dark suit, sitting comfortably with a glass of water in front of him, no alcohol. Tate sat down and began introducing himself by habit, the way a man does at networking dinners. Name, title, hospital, specialty. Garrett didn't introduce himself in return. He only sat in silence, listened to Tate speak, and waited. Tate stopped, slightly unsettled by the silence. He asked, "I'm sorry, I haven't been given your name. Which investor are you?" Garrett didn't answer the question. He didn't need to, because while Tate had been talking, he had begun to notice the small things he hadn't noticed when he first walked in. The restaurant staff lowered their heads when they passed Garrett, not with ordinary politeness, but with the kind of deference shown by people who knew exactly whom they were serving. Knox stood outside the dining room door, his back against the wall, arms folded across his chest, his face expressionless. But his presence made the hallway feel heavier than usual. And this private dining room, Tate suddenly realized, had no windows, only 1 door, and Knox was standing right in front of that door. Tate wasn't stupid. He began to understand that this meeting wasn't about investment, and the man sitting in front of him wasn't an investor. Garrett spoke at last, his voice low and even, neither fast nor slow. "You have 2 choices. 1. You remove every barrier you put up to keep Jolene Whitmore from returning to medicine. Every call you made, every recommendation you gave to hospitals about her, you take all of it back. 2. You do nothing, and next week 4 newspapers will have stories about the 5 patient cases you want forgotten." Tate went pale, not gradually, but all at once, the kind of pale a man becomes when all the air has been pulled out of his lungs. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, because in order to speak, he needed to know whom he was facing, and he didn't know, and that not knowing was the most frightening part, more frightening than any name or title could have been. Garrett stood, buttoned his suit jacket, slowly, exactly the way Tate had buttoned his jacket when he left Pearl's the other day. You don't need to answer me now, but I'd advise you to answer before Monday. Garrett walked out. Knox opened the door for him, closed it behind him, and Tate sat alone in the windowless private dining room, a glass of water in front of him, his hands on the table, and for the first time in his 30-year career, he understood what it felt like to sit across from someone with more power than he had, and be unable to do anything. That was the feeling Jolene Whitmore had endured for 7 months. On Monday, Knox entered the private room at the Meridian at 9 o'clock in the morning, and said briefly, Tate called 3 hospitals this morning, retracted every recommendation he made about Jolene Whitmore. Garrett gave a slight nod. He didn't smile, didn't say good or just as expected, only nodded, then turned back to the ledgers he had been reviewing. Because to Garrett, this wasn't a victory. It was the correction of something wrong. And when you correct something wrong, there's no need to celebrate. You simply finish it, then move on. 1 week after Tate came to the diner that afternoon, Jolene received a phone call. She was washing dishes at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the diner phone rang. Pearl answered, then handed the receiver to her and said, They're looking for you. Jolene dried her hands and took the receiver. On the other end was a woman's voice, professional and polite, introducing herself from the Human Resources Department of a hospital on the north side of Chicago. The hospital wanted to invite her in for an interview for an emergency room nurse position. They had received her professional profile and were very impressed. Jolene stood still with the receiver in her hand, her back against the kitchen wall. She had never applied to this hospital. She had never even heard the hospital's name before, and she was certain there wasn't any professional profile of hers circulating anywhere, because she didn't have a computer, didn't have money to print a resume, and didn't have a lawyer. Who recommended me? She asked. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the woman said, a little hesitant, We received your professional profile through an attorney. I don't have a specific name here, but the file was sent very thoroughly and professionally. Jolene thanked her, said she would get back to them, and set the receiver down. She stood in the kitchen for a while, looking down at her hands, still wet from dishwater. Then she went outside to find Pearl. Did you tell anyone about me? About the fact that I used to be a nurse? Pearl looked at her and shook her head. I don't tell other people's stories to anyone. You know that. Jolene knew. Pearl was right, so it wasn't Pearl. That Tuesday morning, Garrett came to Pearl's right on schedule. Knox sat at the next table as usual. Jolene waited until Garrett had finished eating and was walking toward the door. She didn't go to his table. She went to Knox's. Knox was standing, preparing to follow Garrett. Jolene said, Did someone send my file to a hospital on the north side? Knox looked at her. He didn't answer. Didn't say yes. Didn't say no. Didn't say, I don't know what you're talking about. He only looked at her in silence, then turned and walked out the door after Garrett. And that silence spoke louder than any answer. Jolene had lived long enough with people who said little to know that silence had many kinds. There was the silence of not knowing. There was the silence of not wanting to say, and there was the silence that was the answer. Only the speaker chose not to use words. Knox had just given her the third kind. That night, Jolene walked to the Meridian. She had never been there except in her mind, when she imagined the place Garrett sat when he wasn't at Pearl's. The restaurant was larger than she had expected, with a glass frontage and warm golden light, the kind of place she would never have stepped into without a reason. She had a reason. She pushed the door open and walked in. The hostess looked up at her, looked at her old coat and worn-heeled shoes, and was about to say something when Knox appeared from inside, gave the hostess a slight nod, and the hostess stepped back. Knox didn't stop Jolene. He didn't lead her either. He only stood aside, and Jolene walked past him, straight toward the main dining room, where Garrett was sitting alone at a corner table, a freshly served plate of food in front of him. Jolene stood before his table. She didn't sit, didn't wait to be invited. I don't need anyone clearing the road for me, she said. Garrett looked up. He set his knife and fork down on either side of the plate, slowly, evenly, then straightened in his chair. You're the only person I've met who was willing to trade everything for what was right, he said. I only cleared the obstacle. Whether you walk or not is your decision. You don't have the right to decide for me which obstacles need clearing, Jolene said, her voice not raised, not trembling, but every word clear. Garrett looked at her. 2 seconds of silence. Then he said, You're right. A pause. but I'd do it again in the same situation. Jolene stood there for one more second, then she turned and walked out, past the hostess, through the glass door, and outside. She didn't look back. Knox stood at the door and watched her walk down the sidewalk, then looked back into the dining room. Garrett had picked up his knife and fork again, but he wasn't eating. He was looking at the place where Jolene had just stood, the empty space before the table, then down at his plate, and Knox knew that dinner wouldn't be finished. Outside, Jolene walked back to Pearl's. 3 blocks. She walked more slowly than usual. Her steps weren't as hurried as they had been when she came, because when she arrived, she had anger as fuel, and now the anger had been used up in 4 lines of conversation, leaving her to walk home with whatever remained after anger drained away. The last thing Garrett had said kept repeating in her mind. I'd do it again in the same situation. She crossed the first block. The words echoed. The second block, still echoing. On the third block, she stopped at the corner, looked up at the black, starless Chicago sky, and realized why that sentence wouldn't leave her. Because it was the same sentence she had said to herself 7 months earlier, when she signed her name on the complaint against Harlan Tate, even though she knew exactly what it would cost. I'd do it again. She and Garrett Sinclair weren't the same. She knew that. They stood on different sides of so many lines, but in exactly one place only, they were alike enough to make her uneasy. Both of them were the kind of people willing to pay the price for their decisions and not apologize for deciding. Jolene stood at the corner for a while longer. Then she kept walking, back to the diner, into the storage room, closed the door, and lay down on the sofa. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. She only lay there, looking at the ceiling bulb, and thinking about a man who said, I'd do it again, in the calm voice of someone who had grown used to paying the price without making a sound. While Jolene lay on the sofa in the storage room, staring at the ceiling bulb and thinking about what Garrett had said, on the other side of the city, Garrett was facing an entirely different problem, one he had known would come from the night he threw Bryce out, but hadn't known would come this quickly. Pruitt wanted a meeting. Pruitt was the man who controlled the entire north side of Chicago, a crime boss who had built his empire with patience and the ability to wait for exactly the right moment to swallow the gaps other people left behind. The gap Bryce had left on the west side was precisely the kind of opportunity Pruitt had been waiting for. Knox received the message through an intermediary. Pruitt proposed a meeting, negotiation, a redistribution of territory. Garrett agreed. Not because he wanted to negotiate, but because refusing to meet would be read as weakness, and weakness in this world was more dangerous than any negotiation. They met at a neutral location in the suburbs on Thursday night. Garrett arrived with Knox and 2 other men. 4 people. Pruitt arrived with 6. Garrett noticed the number the moment Pruitt's car stopped, and 6 men stepped out. He said nothing. They went inside, sat across from each other, and Pruitt spoke first. He wanted 40% of the south side. Not a proposal, but a demand. He presented it in the voice of a man reading a contract the other side only needed to sign, listing reasons, analyzing the reality, emphasizing that Garrett had lost Bryce, lost control on the west side, and that Knox had just been wounded, which meant his forces were stretched thin. You're short on men, Sinclair, Pruitt said, leaning back in his chair. You're no longer in a position to negotiate. Garrett listened to the end, didn't interrupt, didn't counter each point. He let Pruitt say everything, because he had learned long ago that the person who talked the most in a room was often the least confident, and letting them finish was the fastest way to confirm it. When Pruitt stopped, Garrett stood. Not slowly, not dramatically, just stood like a man who had heard enough. I came here with 4 men, Garrett said. You came with 6. If you need more bodies in order to feel secure, then you aren't at the level to sit across from me. Pruitt didn't answer right away. His eyes narrowed, the eyes of a man not used to being spoken to so directly, and now weighing whether to react immediately or save his reaction for a more suitable moment. Garrett didn't wait for him to choose. He walked out, Knox and the 2 men following behind him. No one said another word. The engine started. Knox drove, leaving the suburban area and getting onto the highway back toward Chicago. The first 5 minutes in the car were silent. Knox drove, eyes on the road, but his right hand left the wheel for a moment to turn the silver ring on his ring finger, slow and steady. The last time Knox had turned that ring in front of Garrett was the night Bryce was thrown out, and Garrett remembered it. Knox turned his ring when his mind was calculating things his mouth hadn't yet said. And usually, those things weren't good news. Pruitt won't let this go, Knox said, eyes still on the road. I know. You still won't give ground? Give ground once, and you give ground forever. You know that. Knox did know. He had been at Garrett's side long enough to know that sentence wasn't stubbornness. It was an operating principle. In Garrett's world, giving ground once didn't buy peace. It only bought time until the next concession, and the next, until there was nothing left to give. Garrett looked out the car window. Chicago gradually appeared along the horizon, the city lights blinking in the night. He said nothing more, and Knox asked nothing more. But both of them knew, in the way men who had worked together for nearly 10 years knew without needing words, that tonight's negotiation wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Pruitt wasn't a man who accepted refusal and moved on. He was a man who accepted refusal and waited, and when he was done waiting, what came next would no longer be an invitation to negotiate. 2 nights after the negotiation, Pruitt answered, not with words. Garrett left the Meridian at 11 o'clock at night, later than usual because he had stayed behind to review the end-of-month ledgers. Knox drove, taking the familiar road through the south side toward the penthouse. When the car turned onto the street 3 blocks from Pearl's, the headlights caught a car parked across the road. Then 2 more appeared from the alleys on either side. Knox saw it 2 seconds early, enough for him to hit the gas in reverse and turn the wheel, but not enough to avoid it completely. Everything happened very fast, and when it was over, Garrett's car lay tilted at the corner, glass shattered. Knox was pulling Garrett out of the back seat, and Garrett was badly wounded. Knox had to decide in an instant. A hospital would call the police, and the police would ask questions no one in the organization wanted to answer. The organization's private doctor was on the north side, more than 40 minutes away by car. Garrett needed treatment now, not after 40 minutes. Knox looked around. 3 blocks, Pearl's Diner. And inside Pearl's Diner was Jolene Whitmore. Knox lifted Garrett up. 2 men from the organization came to help, and they walked 3 blocks through the night, fast and silent. Garrett half-conscious between 2 men, his feet dragging across the sidewalk. The pounding came at Pearl's back door at 11:40 at night. For the second time that month, Pearl opened the door. She saw Knox, saw Garrett between the 2 men, saw the state he was in, and this time, for the first time Jolene had ever seen, Pearl took a deep breath before saying, "Bring him in." They laid Garrett on the sofa, the old brown fabric sofa in the storage room, the sofa where Jolene slept every night, the sofa where Knox had lain once before. And now Garrett was lying there, eyes closed, face pale, his dark suit stained at the side and back, his breathing short and shallow. Jolene stepped out from the kitchen. She had been awakened by the pounding at the door, and when she saw Garrett on the sofa, she stopped. 1 second, only 1 second, but in that second, she felt something she hadn't felt the night she saved Knox. That night, she had looked at Knox and seen a patient. Tonight, she looked at Garrett and saw someone she knew, someone who had sat at the corner table every Tuesday and Friday, someone who had said, "I'd do it again," in that calm voice 3 nights earlier, and now that person was lying on her sofa, getting worse with every passing minute. Her hands shook. For the first time, her hands shook before an emergency case. She looked down at them, saw them trembling, and understood that if she let them keep trembling, the man on the sofa would be in danger. So she clenched both hands tightly, squeezing until her knuckles went white, then released them. The shaking stopped. She went to the shelf. After the night she saved Knox, she had restocked the kit, bought more gauze, more bandages, more antiseptic with the small wages Pearl paid her. She had rearranged everything on the shelf in the exact order she would need if there was a next time. She had prepared, though she hadn't known she was preparing for this. She took the supplies, washed her hands, and began. Pearl held the flashlight beside her in silence. Knox stood in the corner, his back against the wall, both hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles stark white. He watched Jolene work, and this time he wasn't watching with the curiosity he had carried the first night. He was watching with the silent plea of a man placing the life of the most important person to him in someone else's hands. Jolene worked. Her hands no longer shook, but she had to focus twice as hard as she had the night she saved Knox, because every time she looked at Garrett's face, every time she saw him grimace in pain, even while half-conscious, she felt something pull inside her chest, and she had to push it down, tuck it into a corner, lock it away, and keep going. In the middle of her work, Garrett opened his eyes, not fully, only a slit, and he said, his voice broken, so low that only Jolene could hear it because she was bent close. "My mother." It was the same. No one would help when she needed it. Jolene didn't stop working, she said, her eyes still on the wound, her hands still moving. "I'm here. You aren't going anywhere." She didn't know if Garrett heard her, but she said it. And she said it in the voice she had used for hundreds of patients in the emergency room. The calm, steady voice that said, "I am here, and I won't leave." Only this time, for the first time, she truly felt every word she said instead of merely saying it by procedure. 40 minutes. Jolene worked for 40 minutes. When she wrapped the final layer of bandage, checked that Garrett's breathing had grown steadier, that his condition had stabilized, she stood, took one step back, and then her legs couldn't hold her anymore. She sank down onto the floor beside the sofa, her back against the wall, her head tipped back. She hadn't even washed her hands yet. Her breathing was heavy. All the focus and strength she had poured into the last 40 minutes drained out at once, and what remained was a 27-year-old girl sitting on the storage room floor, exhausted, her hands trembling again, because now she allowed them to tremble. Pearl brought her a glass of water and placed it in her hands. Jolene drank, spilling a little because her hands were shaking. Pearl said nothing. She only stood there for a while, then turned back to watch the door. In the corner of the room, Knox stood still. He looked at Jolene sitting on the floor, looked at Garrett breathing steadily on the sofa, and said, his voice hoarse, low, just loud enough for Jolene to hear, "Thank you." One phrase, from a man Jolene had never heard say it, from a man Pearl had probably never heard say it either, from a man who almost never said it to anyone. Jolene didn't answer. She only gave a faint nod, eyes closed, back against the wall, both hands wrapped around the glass of water, and sat there beside the sofa where she slept every night, the sofa where Garrett Sinclair was now breathing evenly, alive, because of her. Garrett stayed in the storage room for 2 days. Knox wanted to move him out on the first night, but Jolene said he wasn't stable enough to be moved, and Pearl told Knox to sit down and drink a cup of coffee before he argued. Knox sat down, drank the coffee, and didn't argue. During those 2 days, Garrett lay on the sofa, and Jolene slept on the storage room floor, wrapped in a blanket beside him, because she needed to stay close enough to hear if his breathing changed in the night. She changed his bandages twice a day, morning and evening, checked the wound, checked his temperature, checked everything that needed checking with the limited equipment she had. Garrett spoke little, not because he didn't want to speak, but because he was weak, and when he was weak he became even quieter, as if his body automatically shut down everything unnecessary to save its energy for healing. He only spoke when Jolene asked professional questions. "Does this hurt? Can you take a deep breath? Move your arm." He answered briefly, with a nod or a shake of the head, sometimes 1 or 2 words. Pearl came and went, bringing water, bringing porridge, bringing warm towels, never asking long questions, only setting things down and leaving. Knox came twice a day, stood in the doorway and looked in, never crossing the threshold, as if that storage room were Jolene's territory and he respected the border. On the second day, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Jolene woke because she heard Garrett shifting on the sofa. She opened her eyes, looked through the darkness, and saw him lying on his side, eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. He was awake because of the pain, but he didn't cry out, didn't groan, didn't call anyone. He only lay there, eyes open, enduring it. She sat up, took gauze and antiseptic from the shelf, switched on the small flashlight Pearl had left behind, and began changing the dressing. She worked in silence. Garrett watched her work and said nothing. She looked at the wound, checked it, and while wrapping the new gauze, she noticed the watch on his left wrist. The cheap watch she had first seen at the diner, its face scratched, its leather strap worn, looking strangely out of place on the wrist of a man whose every other possession seemed expensive. Knox had removed everything when they brought Garrett in. The chain, the rings, the expensive watch on his right hand, but this watch on his left hand remained. Maybe Knox had forgotten. Maybe Knox knew it wasn't to be taken off. Jolene didn't ask about the watch. She finished wrapping the gauze, put the supplies away, and was about to lie back down on the floor. Then Garrett spoke, not because she had asked, but because at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the body is in pain, when the room is dark, when the only person beside you has just bandaged you with hands both gentle and steady, The things kept too long inside find their own way out, like groundwater slipping through a crack no one had to drill. My mother bought this at a thrift shop, he said, his voice low, slow, each word separated by a breath. $2. Jolene stopped, sat down beside the sofa, on the floor, her back against the edge of it, and listened. She said it ran 2 minutes slow every day, but that was all right, because she was never in a hurry. Silence. The faint ticking of the watch in the dark room, or maybe only something Jolene imagined, but she heard it. Then Garrett went on, and his voice changed. Not lower, but heavier. The heaviness of someone saying something they almost never said. She died because no one would take her for treatment when she needed it. My father said it wasn't worth bothering about. He didn't say more. Didn't explain. Didn't say who his father was, what his father did, how it had happened. Only 2 sentences. But those 2 sentences held an entire life. And Jolene knew that, because she had sentences like that in her own life too. Sentences that, if spoken aloud, needed only 2 lines, but anyone listening would understand that behind those 2 lines were 10 years, 20 years, a whole life turned in another direction because of the words inside them. Jolene didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "I understand." She didn't say any of the things people usually said when someone else spoke of loss, because all those sentences were too small for what Garrett had just placed between them in the dark room at 3 o'clock in the morning. She said, 2 minutes slow every day. So after 20 years, this watch has fallen more than 10 days behind the world. Garrett was silent. Then he said, and she heard something in his voice, almost like a smile, even though he didn't smile. 10 days. Long enough to live differently. Jolene didn't fully understand that sentence. She understood the calculation, but she didn't understand what Garrett meant by living differently. Differently from whom, from what, in what direction. But she remembered it. She remembered the words 10 days, and she remembered the way Garrett said them, lightly, as if those 2 words were a key he had just handed her, without telling her which door it opened. Garrett closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, became steadier. Jolene sat beside him on the floor, her back against the edge of the sofa, close enough to hear him breathe. She didn't leave. Didn't say anything more. There was no need to say anything more. She only sat there, in the small storage room behind a modest diner on Chicago's South Side, at 3 o'clock in the morning, beside a man half the city feared, and whom she had just bandaged for the 2nd time, and she stayed there, because sometimes what people need isn't comfort, or an answer, or a promise. Sometimes it is only someone sitting beside them in the dark, not going anywhere, until morning comes. On the morning of the 3rd day, Knox came to pick Garrett up. He was stable enough to be moved. Jolene confirmed that after one final examination, and she gave Knox the list of things that needed to continue, change the bandage every day, keep it clean, monitor his temperature, and get him to the private doctor within the next 24 hours. Knox nodded, memorized every instruction, and helped Garrett out through the back door. Garrett passed Jolene slowly, stopped for 1 second, and looked at her. He said nothing. She said nothing either. He left. The back door closed. The storage room returned to silence, and Jolene stood alone beside the sofa, still indented from the weight of someone who had lain there, looked at that empty space, then began changing the sofa sheets. 2 days later, the hospital on the north side called back to confirm. They wanted to hire her. Emergency room nurse position, night shift, starting at the beginning of next month. Jolene listened, thanked them, said she would confirm within a week. Then she set the receiver down and didn't feel happy. Didn't feel sad. She only knew she needed to do one more thing before she left. Something she had been thinking about since that 3 o'clock in the morning night, when she sat on the storage room floor beside Garrett, while he told her about the watch and the mother who had refused to bow. That night, Jolene began to write. She sat on the sofa with a few sheets of paper, and the pen Pearl had given her, and she wrote until 2 o'clock in the morning. She wrote for 3 straight nights. By day, she still worked at the diner as usual, but by night she turned the storage room into an office, papers spread across the floor, notes taped to the wall beside the shelf. She began with the file Garrett had gathered on Tate, the file Knox had silently left on a diner table one Tuesday morning, saying nothing about who had sent it, because there was no need to say. She read every page, 5 patient cases, names, dates, hospitals, treatment protocols, outcomes. But she didn't submit that file. She knew a file from Garrett's sources couldn't be used as official evidence. She didn't know how it had been collected, And she didn't want to know. She used it as a map. She took the patients' names, found their families' phone numbers herself through public records, and called from the diner phone in the evening after Pearl had gone home. She explained who she was, what she had once done, and asked whether they would be willing to provide testimony. 3 of the 5 families agreed. She requested copies of medical records through official channels, submitting the requests according to the proper procedure she had learned when she was still working at the hospital. She rebuilt the entire complaint from the ground up, from lawful evidence, from real testimony, from official medical records. She wrote a complaint to the Illinois Medical Board, 32 pages, typed on an old computer Pearl had borrowed from a neighbor friend, and she signed her real name on the final page, Jolene Whitmore. On the 3rd night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Pearl got up to use the bathroom and saw the storage room light still on. She stood in the doorway and looked in, seeing Jolene sitting amid the pile of papers, eyes red from lack of sleep, hands still typing. "What are you doing, staying up this late for 3 nights straight?" Pearl asked. Jolene looked up. "Last time I reported him with words, they silenced me. This time I'm doing it with documents, evidence, and my real signature." Pearl looked at her, looked at the papers on the floor, the computer screen, the red but bright eyes of the girl who had been washing dishes for her for months. Then she said, "Eat breakfast before you go file it." She turned and went back to sleep. The next morning, Jolene ate breakfast, drank the coffee Pearl made, then went to the post office and mailed the complaint. Garrett found out 2 days later through Knox. Knox said briefly, "The girl at Mrs. Pearl's diner filed an official complaint against Harlan Tate with the Illinois Medical Board, with independently gathered evidence, unrelated to the organization's file." Garrett listened, then stayed silent for a while. Then he said, "She used my ammunition but fired the shot herself. That's exactly her style, not angry." In his voice there was something Knox recognized as close to admiration, something he almost never heard in Garrett, because Garrett rarely admired anyone, and when he did, he didn't say it directly. He only changed the rhythm of his voice a little, just enough for someone who knew how to listen to hear it. During her final week at Pearl's, Jolene cleaned out the storage room. There wasn't much to pack. She had come with 1 backpack, and she was leaving with 1 backpack. She folded the blanket and left it on the sofa. She took the medical kit down from the shelf, looked at the round mark on the surface where the kit had sat for months, then placed it in her backpack. She stood at the storage room door and looked inside. The old sofa, the ceiling bulb, the iron shelf with the round mark. She didn't cry. She had cried once in this room already, and once was enough. She stood there for a while, closed the door, and carried her backpack out. Pearl stood at the counter, arranging cups for the morning shift. Jolene stood in front of the counter, backpack on her shoulder. "Thank you," she said. Pearl didn't look up. Her hands kept arranging the cups, steady, slow, one at a time. "You still owe me 2 weekend dishwashing shifts. Stop by and pay them back when you're free." Jolene laughed, and Pearl, though she didn't look up, knew that laugh was different. She had heard Jolene laugh a few times over the past months, but those times, the laughter had never reached her eyes. It stopped at her mouth and faded, like a candle blown out by the wind before it had a chance to burn all the way. This time, the laugh reached her eyes. Pearl knew because she glanced up for 1 second, only 1 second, then went back to arranging the cups. 1 second was enough. Jolene walked out the door, backpack on her shoulder, her steps lighter than the day she had walked in. 6 months later, Jolene Whitmore wore a nurse's uniform, night shift, emergency room, a hospital on the north side of Chicago. Her shift began at 7 o'clock in the evening and ended at 7 o'clock in the morning, 12 hours. And she chose that shift not because she had no other option, but because she liked nights. She had always liked nights, even back at the old hospital, because the night shift was when the emergency room truly needed people who were good, not merely people who were numerous. And Jolene knew she was good. She knew it now, in a way she hadn't known before losing everything. Before, she had been good because she had been trained. Now, she was good because she had saved lives on an old sofa in the storage room of a modest diner with a medical kit bought from dishwashing wages. And if she could do that, she could do anything. Dr. Harlan Tate had his medical license suspended by the Illinois Medical Board 3 months after Jolene filed the complaint. The evidence was too clear. The testimony from 3 patients' families too detailed. The official medical records too full of inconsistencies. The board had no other choice. Tate didn't go to prison, but he lost his license, lost his position, lost the name he had built over 30 years in the field. And Jolene didn't know where he was now, and didn't care. She hadn't filed the complaint because she wanted revenge. She had filed it because 5 people had lain in hospital beds and 2 of them had never stood up again, and someone had to say that in documents bearing a real signature, and she was the only one willing to sign. Every Monday morning, after her night shift, Jolene stopped by Pearl's. She arrived at 5:15, when Pearl had just opened the door, when the diner was still empty, and the coffee had just been made. She sat at the table by the window and ordered fried eggs and toast, just like the first breakfast Pearl had placed in front of her on the day she washed dishes to ask for a job. The diner hadn't changed. Pearl hadn't changed. Gray hair neatly pinned up, hard voice, precise hands, the diner opening exactly at 5 o'clock. Not earlier, not later. Once, when Jolene went into the back kitchen to get water, she glanced through the open storage room door. Inside, the sofa was still there, the blanket folded at one end, the ceiling bulb, still only a ceiling bulb, and on the iron shelf, in the place where she had once kept her medical kit, there was a round mark, a faint imprint on the metal surface, where the kit had sat for months, long enough to leave a trace, small enough that no one would notice it except the person who had placed it there. Jolene looked at that round mark for 2 seconds, then turned back out to get the water. Garrett still came to Pearl's every Tuesday and Friday morning. Jolene came on Mondays. They were never in the diner at the same time, and Jolene didn't know whether that was coincidence or intention, but she didn't ask, and Garrett didn't explain. Pearl knew both of them asked after each other through her. Garrett asked by not asking. He only looked at Pearl when she set his plate down, and Pearl understood that look. She would say, "She's well. Working nights. Still drinks her coffee strong and black." Jolene asked by asking directly, "How is he?" And Pearl would answer, "Still sitting at the corner table. Still leaving 10 times the bill. Still wearing a $3,000 suit to a modest diner." And both of them laughed when Pearl said that, each on a different morning. But Pearl heard both laughs and knew they were more alike than either of them thought. One Monday morning in early March, Jolene came to Pearl's at 5:15 as usual. She sat down at the table by the window and saw that on the table there wasn't only the hot cup of coffee Pearl always had waiting for her. Beside the coffee was a small square box wrapped in brown paper. No card, no sender's name. Jolene looked at the box, then at Pearl behind the counter. Pearl said, without looking up, her hand pouring coffee for herself, "He stopped by at 4 o'clock in the morning, before even me." Jolene picked up the box, opened it. Inside, resting on black velvet, was a watch. Not the cheap watch with the worn leather strap that Garrett wore on his left wrist. He would never give that one to anyone because that watch belonged to his mother. This one was different. New. Simple. White face, silver hands, light brown leather strap. Beautiful in a way that didn't need to be expensive to be beautiful. Beautiful because it fit, because it was right, because it looked like something the giver had thought carefully about before choosing. Jolene turned the watch over. Engraved on the back in small letters was a line, 10 days, long enough to live differently. Jolene sat still, looking at the words, looking at the watch in her hand, and she understood. Garrett's mother's watch ran 2 minutes slow every day because it belonged to the past, belonged to a woman who was never in a hurry, belonged to a time already gone that Garrett kept on his wrist as if holding on to the last remaining piece of his mother. This watch kept the correct time. Jolene tried it on, the face fitting neatly against her wrist, light and cool. She watched the second hand move, steady, accurate, not 1 second behind, because this watch didn't belong to the past. It belonged to what lay ahead. Pearl watched her from behind the counter, saw her fasten the watch around her wrist, saw her sit still for a while, saw her take a sip of coffee. Then Pearl turned back to arranging cups, because the diner would soon be busy and she had work to do, and because there were moments when a person needed to sit alone with a watch, and a cup of coffee, and a line engraved on the back that no one else should look too closely at. Jolene finished the last sip of her coffee, set the cup down on the table, stood, and pulled her coat over her shoulders. The new watch on her wrist was light and cool, its second hand moving in steady beats, right on time, not 1 second slow. She pushed open the diner door and stepped outside. Chicago was waking up. The elevated train passed overhead, with the familiar sound she had heard hundreds of times. The iron shutters of storefronts were being pulled up. Early workers' footsteps moved along the sidewalk, and the city took the first breath of a new day. 7 months earlier, she had sat curled against the wall of a closed train station, in the middle of a winter night, at 7 degrees below zero, quietly counting what she had left. 1 backpack, 1 clean set of clothes, 1 medical kit, and 1 creased photograph in the corner. Today she walked out of a small diner on the south side, where she had once washed dishes, once slept in the storage room, once cried on the floor, once saved the life of the most powerful man on the south side, on the very sofa where she had slept every night, and she walked forward, her backpack lighter on her shoulder than it had been 7 months ago, the new watch on her wrist keeping perfect time, toward the hospital where she belonged. Inside the diner, Pearl stood behind the counter, looking through the glass door. She watched Jolene pass by, her steps steady, her back straight, never looking back. Pearl held a glass in her hand, a glass that had long been clean, and she wiped it, slowly, round and round, because sometimes hands need something to do when the mind is somewhere else. She wiped until Jolene disappeared around the corner, then set the glass down, turned back to the kitchen, lit the stove, and began a new day the way she always did, because Pearl's opened at 5 o'clock. Not earlier, not later, whether someone had just walked away or not. Jolene Whitmore's life began again, with a question asked by a 64-year-old diner owner at 5 o'clock on a winter morning. Do you know how to wash dishes? And the answer to the first question of this story? If you lose everything for telling the truth, would you dare to do it again? Jolene had already answered. Twice, and both times, she chose the same. If this story touched you, please press the like button and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that doing the right thing is never wasted. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings from deep within your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the compelling stories we share every day. We wish every one of you watching this video truly good health, a joyful life, and peace in each passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.